Welcome back to the Global Leaders Innovation Summit. My name is Sherry Coutu. I'm a serial entrepreneur and investor, and I'm here today with Dame Melanie Dawes, who's the CEO of Ofcom, Tim Roberts, who's the MD and UK co-head at Alex Partners, and Alex van Summeren, who's the Chief Scientific Advisor for National Security for the government. We are here today to talk about how to build back trust in the internet. This online world, as in the realm of high percentage of societal interaction, it's increased prominence recently, particularly through the pandemic, and it's created vulnerability to a lot of things: cyber attacks, fraud, social media misuse, and online abuse rising. And this has impacted our consumer trust in the internet, and it's called into questions its ethical responsibility. So what we want to do is we're going to frame it a little bit about what happened to cause this state of affairs to come about, but we're going to spend the bulk of our time today to talk about what needs to be done to restore the consumer trust in the internet and whose responsibility is it for making it safe. So with that, I'm going to start with asking the panelists to introduce themselves, and I'm going to ask Melanie to start, followed by Tim and then Alex, and then we're going to dive into the state of play. But we'll just start with short introductions first, please. Melanie, thank you.
Thank you, Sherry. Well, yes, I'm Melanie Dawes, and I'm the Chief Executive of Ofcom, the UK communications regulator, which amongst our duties for overseeing media and telecoms in the UK, we will also be overseeing new regulations for online safety over the coming years.
Great. Tim, tell me about yourself.
Thank you, Sherry. Hello, everybody. I'm Tim Roberts from Alex Partners. And I've spent the last 25 years or so working in technology and risk and compliance, and increasingly on the intersection between those two topics, applying technology to better risk management and figuring out the risks that are associated with technology and data, primarily privacy and security. And I work with banks who've been regulated for a long time, and I work with tech companies who are getting used to being regulated, and a lot of those changes we'll talk about today.
Lovely, thank you. Alex, why don't you talk a little bit about your background, which is multivaried. You've had a whole lot of hats on around this subject over the past 25 years, which again makes it even more interesting in your current position.
Thank you. Hello, everybody. I'm Alex van Summeren, and I've previously been a technology entrepreneur. So I've built a number of businesses, including businesses making products in the areas of internet security and privacy. And then for about the past decade, I've been a venture capital investor, investing in these kinds of technologies, so-called deep tech, early stage technologies all around the world, particularly in the UK. And actually, just in the last few months, I've taken on this new position as the Chief Scientific Advisor for National Security. And so that means I'm about helping the UK government use science more effectively in its day-to-day business and ensuring that it gets access to the best kinds of technology to discharge its obligations, but also to make sure that our policies are well established so that we can actually work effectively with the internet and ensure that we allow citizens the right kind of benefits whilst at the same time delivering our jobs as the government side of things in national security.
And you and I both sit on the SIT committee for the Royal Society, which is looking at the interplay between, government and also education, universities, and how do we pull into line that side of things as well. So let's again, sort of my background is also as a technology entrepreneur, most latterly in government, but I also sit on the board of the London Stock Exchange and also the board of Pearson, and that takes me from financial services to education, both of which are quite heavily regulated, but from different perspectives, and again allows, and I'm still very much an angel investor, and I'm very worried about making sure that the people who make these new companies, which we need to be created, are aware of the risks and the power that they have in their hands, so that they use tech for good rather than inadvertently use it for other purposes. So we're going to play around with that a little bit in the coming minutes. Right. Okay. So I'm going to start with you, Melanie. How have we seen consumer trust in tech evolve over this past year in particular? What have you seen?
Yeah, well, it's a good place to start, isn't it? And we do a lot of research into consumer attitudes in Ofcom. We always have done. And so we track this very regularly. And of course, what we've seen over the past year is once again quite how extraordinary the services that we get from technology companies, and in particular from the big platforms. We've become even more dependent on them in the past year, and our friendships, our families, our businesses, we wouldn't have kept things going during the pandemic and all the lockdowns without those services. But at the same time, what we see is that there is a real lack of trust in some of the things that people are experiencing online now. And we see that from the perspective of comparing it with other forms of media. So we can see 7 in 10 UK consumers really trust what they get from the British TV and radio industry, and have really valued that during the pandemic with all the misinformation. But that compares with only a third of consumers trust what they get online by way of news. And we also see that people are more and more concerned about experiencing harms like bullying, hate speech, and so on social media platforms. And you can even see that for younger people, teenagers. More than half say that they've experienced something really unwelcome in the past year. So I think there are some things to address, while at the same time, the platforms still are enormously important in so many aspects of our lives.
Very much agree. Thank you. Tim, can you also talk to us about what you've seen more, not so much from the consumer sort of regulatory point of view, but from an industry and business point of view?
Thanks, Sherry. Yeah, and maybe just for a moment to look at the backdrop behind COVID, and then I'll come to what COVID has done to that. Obviously, in the background, we've seen this sort of explosion in digital products and services, digitally native businesses across industry sectors, retailers, banks, social media companies, other entertainment and media offerings. That explosion, of course, is sort of overwhelming consumers. And so the general backdrop I would describe is of people sort of exploring that explosion of offerings whilst not fully understanding what's happening to my data, what risks am I being exposed to as I immerse myself in this new range of offerings and this great sort of proliferation. Then if you overlay COVID on that, I think it's had good and bad effects. It may seem perverse to say it's had good effects, but I think one of the beneficial effects is it's prompted people to think about, if you're using apps for health purposes, if we're worried and focusing our attention on where are governments and healthcare researchers and pharma companies getting the data they need to understand, where are epidemiologists getting the data they need, people are seeing the value of that data and the value of sharing that data, but also seeing the trade-offs between the benefit of us agreeing as a society to give data to people developing drugs and people doing track and trace, and conversely the risks of giving them access to that data. So it feels to me like it's brought very vividly those issues to the forefront of your average consumer in a way that they weren't prior to COVID. People, who were using, I won't say the names of individual social media offerings, but that were recording themselves dancing for a short video clip or something like that. In general, they weren't thinking about what data they were revealing in the background of that video or in their metadata generally. Now I think people are much more thinking about it, and it's more in the forefront of people's minds. And maybe we'll talk a bit more about the trade-offs between the value of giving your data and the risks of giving your data. But I think that's become more a subject of public discourse, which I think is good. Obviously, the bad thing is we've seen an explosion of cybercrime during this period of home working and greater online, use of online channels. Cyber criminals don't rest. It's been a great opportunity for them. So that's clearly happened in parallel.
Could I ask you to touch upon the responsibility of businesses for stewarding that data? And I'll probably come over to again, and then because some of the other thing that's eroded are the breaches by hackers of corporate databases and also government databases. But can you just touch on what you've seen there happening? I know that the things that we go through at the stock exchange and at Pearson are, again, really important, and we think really carefully about it. But talk a little bit about how that has changed in the past year because of the rapid development of these technologies.
Yes, and it really gets to the heart of what is trust. And if it's trust around my data, I think I would summarize it in 3 ways. This is probably an oversimplification, but I think of it as, am I clear what I'm doing with your data? have I given you a reason to believe I will do what I've said with your data? And do I actually do what I've said I will do with your data? And obviously, we've seen people fail against at least, any and all of those at different times. And obviously, we've seen regulators intervene for those reasons. And I think, so even without regulators, I think companies, if they want to build and maintain trust, they have to actually set out those three aspects. What am I doing with your data? How am I going to live up to that, and actually living up to it and proving it I've lived up to it, that I'm not selling your data to somebody else, etc. During COVID, I think we've seen people shocked by what is actually happening to their data in various ways. Sometimes it's been stolen. Sometimes fraudsters have gained access to it, and we've seen phishing emails, etc., exploiting the anxiety we have around our health. So if you get a phishing email that's offering you a jab early, or offering you offering you some other healthcare benefit, you're more vulnerable in a time of heightened stress. Companies have got to react to that. Companies have got to react to the fact that their customer behavior is changing because of the stresses consumers are under. Their lifestyles have changed dramatically over the last year and a half. Companies have to react to that if they want to maintain trust in a crisis. In the same way, if you're a household insurer and there's a hurricane, you have to show customers you're there for them in that unusual period.
Yes, and I think they need to train their own staff and directors in many cases as well, because things are changing so quickly to keep on top of it. Alex, do you can I invite you to see that? I love that. Sorry. Let me stop it all. I was making sure that I was on time. There, I was on time to turn to Alex, and I have now done it. I'm sure they can edit that part out.
I'm grateful for the intro. So thanks, Sherry. And I think excellent points made by both Melanie and Tim here. The increasing concerns that consumers quite reasonably have about how their data is being used and abused put a real responsibility, I think, on corporations and on government to ensure not only that they comply with the law, several aspects of which, of course, are being alluded to by Tim in a lot of what he's just described is about data protection law. And one of the interesting contexts we're in at the moment, of course, is the transition of how the UK sits within data protection law, because it's no longer going to be subject to European Union data protection law. So some choices are being made about how that might change right now, and that's obviously important. But then there's also the critical point about people who just won't obey the law, criminals doing things with data, and the duty of care that corporations have around people's personal information is one thing. But of course, there's actually a simple profit motivation issue too, which is if you are incompetent about protecting your customers' data, then you are probably going to actually damage your business, and you are probably going to lose consumer trust. And that may actually be almost irreparable. These kinds of significant episodes of data theft that occur often damage brands so dramatically that they actually struggle to recover. They certainly damage share prices, and they may actually ultimately hold those businesses below the waterline and make them sink. So I think that it's critical for businesses to think about both their simple commercial goals and obligations and their legislative and compliance obligations, and both of those sets of concerns need to inform how they manage their data, how they protect their data, how they build their defenses, and how they advertise to consumers that they are doing all of those things well.
Where do you think we are? So we know that there has been a breakdown of trust. Do you think it's a stewardship, or do you think that things are just, and people aren't taking their responsibilities seriously enough, or that things are moving so quickly that it's gotten ahead of them and they don't yet know what to do in order to steward properly and protect themselves for the bad behaviors who you can sadly are a part of our world? Which of it is it? Is it what is the cause for this breakdown? And that will lead us to how we fix it.
So I'll just speak. I hope other people will join in. I think it's very much like an insurance issue. Generally, people are very poor about getting insurance until after they've been hit once. It's a sort of human nature problem. They don't really believe it's going to happen to them. and they only take insurance seriously after it's happened to them once, which is, arguably already too late. So I think, the reality is these episodes are starting to occur for real, whereas in the past they were maybe things which were trailed in the media, and boards just didn't really take them seriously. Perhaps they didn't really understand them. The upshot has been that once enough companies actually get hit, everybody starts to take it a lot more seriously, and one would hope that issues of cybersecurity were now board review issues in every board meeting. Certainly they are in most serious organizations, but that only comes about because so many board members have read so many terrifying stories about the disasters that have befallen other companies that they've really been forced to confront the problem properly.
Tim?
Yeah, I mean, I think I agree with the broad shape of what you're saying there, Alex, which I think is industries tend to run ahead of the risks. They see the opportunities, but they don't see the risks until a bit later. Consumers are probably the same, but consumers can be more easily forgiven because they don't have the resources that companies have. And I think there's a parallel, almost a historical pattern we're seeing here, where you see a proliferation of new products, new businesses, startups, venture capital flows into the industry. And then we start seeing the consequences, and then we start seeing better risk management, cyber insurance, etc., and then regulation. So in the same way, in the run-up to the global financial crisis, we saw an explosion in the credit markets. Suddenly, people could get credit cards, borrow mortgages, etc., in ways they'd never done before. That debt was repackaged and distributed in ways it had never been done before. But then we saw the consequences with the global financial crisis. There was a crash and a revolution of regulation. There's a bit of a similar pattern in the way data is being used, proliferated, repackaged, sold, traded. And I think therefore it's incumbent on the industry to manage that and be ahead of it and make sure the board is owning customer treatment, security, privacy, etc. But also I think inevitably it does require regulation. I'm not obviously here with a brief for any regulator or for the government, but I think it levels the playing field and gives the industry predictability in a way that is helpful. Whereas if you rely on the industry to self-regulate, it doesn't give certainty and predictability. It makes it very hard to decide what to invest and how much and what to do. So I think there's an opportunity for collaboration between the industry and regulators in this zone that is sorely needed.
Okay, well, it's probably a good segue over to Melanie to a certain extent. What kind of collaboration do you look for with industry to make sure that they are, well, the social media giants are good stewards of that data and that they don't become a surveillance tool or anything else, and also so that the corporates have some guidance as to what is expected practice, because it is moving quite quickly, and guidance is helpful here. What are you doing to sort of align interests and also make sure people know where the line is, and not only what happens if they cross the line, but that the line is there and that be careful, you don't want to cross it.
Yeah, well, look, it's a hugely challenging task. I think it's important to say that. And some of the challenges that we're seeing in trust, and I should also say, by the way, that it isn't just internet companies, it isn't just technology companies where trust is at a premium. I mean, it is a global thing, and it is across all industries. So it isn't just this sector, but it certainly is an issue for this sector. But it's a consequence of a massive pace of change, growth in the number of users, in the global reach by platforms that is unprecedented. And we bandy that word around a lot, don't we? But I think in this case, it really is true. We've never seen anything quite like this. So we're in a situation today where this growth has happened, this huge disruption of our traditional industries and of the ways we communicate has happened without any standards or any kind of view really being taken by any parliament or any elected government in any country yet. And so the way that we fix that, I think, and certainly I can only speak for the UK at this stage, but the government's approach is to put a duty of care on the platforms that really requires them to go in and work out what's going on in their own space. So who are their users? What are the problems they're facing? What are the kinds of things they need to tackle, and then what are the solutions they're going to put in to tackle those problems. Above all, what the UK regime will be about is transparency and accountability to the public and to parliaments and to users and to parents about what's going on in their platforms. It won't be about detailed rules of, as long as you do this, you'll be fine. It's going to be a more dynamic and, in a way, a more searching request than that, but also one that acknowledges that actually the platforms themselves have to, they are the ones that know their services, they understand how their technology is used, they are the ones who are going to be best placed to come up with the solutions rather than a regulator designing those solutions for them. So that's the sort of shape of the regulation that is being designed in the UK, going through Parliament, of course, hasn't done so yet, but that's the overall approach that I'm expecting.
There's a question here saying, has it come to the time where we should move beyond rethinking privacy and instead focus on data ownership? And it seems to me we've just recovered from thinking about we own someone's data to actually respecting the ownership that a person, a user has over that. But I'd love to hear your thoughts on, I think it's my data and it's, whatever I'm using, I should be able to have control over seeing what you have and give you permission to do it. But again, it's interesting to have that question because it looks like it's almost going full tilt and saying, well, no, the companies or the social media own that data. I'm not sure that that's the case, but like to hear, Tim, you're nodding your head, like to hear who owns the data. Is it the user or is it the company or is it the platform? And maybe we can tease that out a little bit.
I mean, I think this is a really interesting question because if you ask consumers how they feel about their data, I think it's very different whether you're talking about their medical records, for example, or the fact that I just went to the coffee shop to buy a coffee and I have a skinny latte. That trivial piece of that, quote unquote, trivial piece of data, the latter example, I don't feel any great ownership of. I don't really care as a consumer. It's a low engagement issue for me. However, of course, it's valuable to somebody. And when you aggregate large amounts of that very low individual value data, suddenly it becomes very powerful because you correlate it with a whole bunch of other data. You can segment me, you can predict my behavior, you can sell to me more effectively, etc. So I think if we put the onus on the individual to decide what happens to their data, I think that's quite challenging because, as I say, I'm very interested in what happens to my medical records, and we've seen a lot of controversy around data use by the NHS. And I think that's probably been exacerbated by COVID, people's attention to that issue of how the NHS is allowed to use patient data, anonymized or otherwise, has gained a lot more sensitivity. And there's a lot more people who have responded to petitions on that issue, for example. But if it's down to little, these tiny data points, which are aggregated in very large volumes, I think it's quite hard to ask the individual to decide what you want to be done with that data, unless you can simplify it for them, unless you can find solutions that allow them to make macro global decisions about their data and then potentially sell access to it or allow access to it. And I think one of the other speakers in London Tech Week is Tim Berners-Lee, who has a concept called SOLID, which is around individual ownership of data with protection around it. These are very complex things to imagine, though, being implemented across the industry. I wonder whether we're past the point of no return in terms of reinventing the relationship between the individual, the data they generate, and the advertisers and consumer product providers that are interested in that data. I don't have a solution to that, but I worry that it's too late to reinvent that relationship, and therefore the focus needs to be on those companies and how they treat me, what they do with my data, rather than changing the data dynamic and giving me control over it.
Yeah. Alex, do you have a point to make on that?
I think it's important to maintain the sanctity of ownership of personal data of all kinds at all scales. So I actually am anxious about the idea that my trip to the coffee shop is somehow less important or more deserving of exploitation than some other kinds of activities of mine, my explicit postings on social media, for example. So I think surely the correct model has to be that the default assumption is that everything about a person should belong to that person. and then how we establish the mechanisms that protect that data and what the defaults are. In other words, for instance, whether I must give permission before that data can be exploited by somebody else, or whether I have to opt out of that kind of data exploitation. Those are very important decisions. My personal preference would be that actually by default, my personal data is always mine and other people cannot exploit it without my permission. Now, the point that I think Tim's making is that the level of understanding and informedness that people have to have in order to make those decisions on a person by person level is very high, and it's higher than the default, you know, that people, most people don't think about this stuff and don't know how to decide. And so it's for legislators to protect individuals first and foremost, and it's for corporations to have to ensure that they have individuals' personal opt-in my opinion, before they actually are allowed to do that exploitation. I might add for the record that this is my personal opinion, not government policy.
Well, why don't we move on to, and I'll call on you next, Melanie, because I think you probably will have some policy there, just in terms of the ethics and the responsibility. So if it's the responsibility of the government to protect its citizens and companies to protect their employees' data, first and foremost, but also their employees from being in a position to unethically exploit other people's data that they may have acquired through those people's use of the service. Let's tackle that a little bit about what can we do. We'll first think about citizens, Melanie, if that's okay. And then I want to think a little bit about corporations. You know, should we, at the board, make sure that there is an ethics committee, and how many of the algorithms that are being used within the company should come up, and do we sign off those policies, and how much training needs to occur? So I want to talk about both of those, because I think they're important for London Tech Week and for London remaining the global, you know, well, not London, the UK, remaining at the forefront of data and privacy. And I don't want to untangle the two. I want to look at one first and then the other. They are obviously entwined together, but there's separate responsibilities there.
Yeah, so look, I think you know, look, I think the task of regulation in trying to tackle some of these problems and improve accountability and transparency, I hope is something that's going to help the tech companies as well. I think we're all facing into this problem. I think, you know, most people acknowledge that it's there. And the individual solutions in terms of governance or what's done about changing the way that products are designed, they're going to vary by company. I mean, there is a huge variety in the nature of platforms out there, whether it's, you know, adult content sites on the one hand through to platforms which are used by children. I guess I would say that transparency for me is the watchword. So it may well be that ethics committees are part of the answer, but internal governance doesn't solve the problem, however good it is, of how you actually explain to your users. And so picking up from what Tim was saying earlier around data and how that's used, I think it's the same for the wider experience that users are having on the platform. That transparency and acknowledgement, really, that the scale of these platforms means that, you know, not everything that happens on them is okay. Acknowledging that, understanding it, analysing it, and taking responsibility for that, I think that's the first really important step, and the one that the UK regime will put in place, and then putting in place solutions with transparency about what impact they're having. And I think what I'm hoping we'll get out of this from the UK perspective, that I hope will have real impact in use globally, is a sense also, because we will be reporting as the regulator across the whole sector regularly. I expect that's part of the legislative framework. So we'll be able to do some comparisons, start to get more transparency out there about the different tools and techniques that can be used, start to get more sense of best practice.
Yeah. And in the best practice, I was part of the Institute of the Application of AI in Education. And their recommendations weren't just policy recommendations, but they also extended their recommendations to corporates and to anybody who bought anything, which is, you shouldn't buy from this company unless you look at their privacy sort of statements. Do you buy into, you know, if you're buying something that uses, you know, an algorithm or AI, do you go as far as saying if you work for the government in your procurement, you should make sure that you do check this? They also made recommendations to the investment community saying if you're going to invest in a tech company, then make sure that you understand how to answer this question. And I think it should extend as far as that, because that way, at a systemic way, you'll clamp it, in all of the places where it can be I guess sort of generated or backstopped.
Yeah, look, I think those who are, if you like, intermediaries on behalf of other consumers, should be thinking about, as they do in so many other areas, whether it's environmental sustainability or other ethical questions, should be thinking, in ways that are appropriate for them about the use of data and so on, and other issues to do with the tech companies that they're dealing with as well. But I think at the same time, we mustn't solve these problems by just putting the onus on the user. And I think it's not something that will in the end be effective, because you've got millions, billions of users every single day making choices. You cannot expect that to solve the problems that are there. It's got to be something about the platforms themselves taking responsibility up front to think about how products are designed, how safety is being built in a way that tackles some of the problems that we're seeing, tackles those problems of trust, but also, keeps these incredible services at the forefront of our lives in the way that we all believe, I think, has been so productive for the economy, but also for society.
Yeah, no, I don't disagree, but again, a platform to my mind is a sort of company that I have made like 60 or 70 investments in. So platforms are run by people. They have boards of directors, and those boards of directors usually have shareholders. And I also go back to the stock exchange. So a platform isn't an amorphous thing. It does have governance and people you can target and make sure that you hold to account for that. And it's just where do you target interventions and make sure that there's a alignment so that everybody pulls into alignment and understands why we're acting in our own self-interest as opposed to succumbing to heavy regulation and, oh, isn't it horrible that we have to do this? We are doing it for a good reason. So again, platforms are run by people. I would never get away from, it's not, they are run by people. Those people live in our countries and they should be subject to our laws.
Well, although, Sherry, if I may, that does raise an important point, which is, in fact, many of these platforms are not run by people in our countries. They are run by other countries, and the people who run them may not ever set foot in our countries. And yet, of course, we expect our laws to prevail for our citizens using those services from our country. And so the jurisdictional challenges are significant. Essentially, we're asking each of these large platforms to obey different rules for different users in different places, which is hard. That doesn't mean that they shouldn't have to do it. It just means that the expectation on them needs to be well understood. And of course, you referred also importantly to the fact that these organizations ultimately are run by people. And it turns out that the people who run these organizations have different ideas about what is and is not the appropriate level of privacy to offer their users. So we can think of some social media platforms which take quite extreme positions on the freedom of speech and the tolerable level of behavior on those platforms. And that informs the extent to which they are willing to not only regulate themselves and make good decisions about how their users should be allowed to behave, but also actually it makes an impact on whether or not they're even willing to honor the laws of the countries in which they operate. And some of them take the view that they're bigger than the countries and essentially can afford to ignore the laws, which is a pretty difficult and probably untenable state of affairs.
I definitely agree that those are hugely important points. Melanie, can I just ask you to comment on how do you as a regulator coordinate your actions and thoughts with other regulators around the world? Because again, we are an island, but we do operate in a global. How do you go about coordinating the way that you work with others?
Yeah, well, that's an incredibly important question for us. And the task of online regulation in any country and for any regulator is going to require more collaboration and more working across boundaries than ever before, I believe. And in the UK, we've actually set up something we call the Digital Regulatory Cooperation Forum to bring together our competition authorities, our Data Protection and Information Authority, our Financial Conduct Authority, and Ofcom as the communications regulator, so that we can make sure that we're seeing all dimensions of this challenge together and join up in a way that actually I hope will help business and those that we're regulating, so that we don't trip you up with multiple different rules, but also to make sure that we can sometimes be more concerted in the action we're taking and join up where we can see a problem and work out, whose particular levers are going to be the ones that will tackle that. And the same also works internationally. Every country has its own regulatory setup. The geography varies. If I look at the US, for example, the FCC, the FTC, it's a slightly different structure to the one that we have in the UK. But nearly every country is beginning to think about these issues. And what Alex said about the fact that actually the jurisdiction is often not in our own countries. As regulators, we are defining rules for our own jurisdictions, but we are dealing with companies that are headquartered and running services from overseas. Does mean we're going to need to coordinate very, very extensively. And I go back to what at the heart of the online safety regime in the UK, what there will be is the onus on the platforms, a duty of care on the platforms, and starting with their responsibility rather than setting up a set of very detailed and prescriptive rules from one jurisdiction that in the end actually misses the mark, as well as just being a bit of a nightmare for everybody to operate.
Yeah, I think the let's call it a passporting system. I think that translating from here to there is really important. So Tim, I'm going to ask you a question now in terms of rebuilding the trust and turning to that. What do you think the tech industry and maybe start with financial services, which as I know is where you've spent many years. What do you think they should do to be more transparent about how they're using data, storing data, and sharing it potentially with others? And how do you get them to be more transparent? And is there best practice that you've seen? And are people coming together, or are they getting further apart?
I mean, I think on that very last point, I think it's early days. So it's always perilous to hold anyone out as best practice anyway, because these are difficult, challenging, rapidly evolving risks. And so today's hero could easily be tomorrow's, problem child. So I think, though, in financial services, I think we've made a lot of progress, actually, in financial institutions clarifying to their customers, what am I doing with your money? When I try and sell you something, what's the nature of our relationship? Am I an independent advisor, or have I got an interest in the product I'm selling you, etc.? What's the nature of our relationship? Clarifying that. It's not perfect, but I think the industry and the regulators have made a lot of progress under the banners of treating customers fairly, making clear what the proposition is in complex products, which everyone agrees need regulating, because you don't know what you're buying when you buy an intangible financial product. And a lot of that is true, of course, about electronic or digital services. You don't know what you're buying. You don't know exactly the nature of the relationship. And if I sign up to use a product or a service online, who's really providing what to me, and what am I really providing to them? There's a catchphrase I love, which says, if you don't know what the product is, you're the product. Yes. If people don't understand what a search engine actually is, or what a social media platform actually is as a business, how's it making money? One of the financial regulatory inventions they call business model analysis. How does a company actually make money? If I'm an independent financial advisor or a pension company, how am I making money from my customers? Go follow the money. That's a great watchword amongst financial regulators. I think it's true in technology and data. Yeah. How are these companies making money? How are they monetizing the relationship, the eyeballs, the clicks? Making that more transparent to the customer, I think, is really helpful. Helping the population understand when they go and search something, what's going on when you type something into a search engine? Yeah. How are they making money from that? I mean, I work in this sector, and it's taken me a while to understand this. It's very complex. Then the other thing I wanted to say, that just to click on something you said earlier, Sherry, that Melanie's also alluded to about people-run platforms. I mean, I think putting an onus on boards and on senior management is important, not just because kind of morally they're in charge, but also a lot of these problems have been caused by technology, and we need to apply that creativity and innovation to managing the risks as well. So it's not that there's going to be a silver bullet solution. We're not going to, I mean, I don't think tomorrow someone is going to suddenly invent the antidote to fake news. I wish that were possible. However, if social media allow the proliferation of fake news or inappropriate content, harmful content, whatever it is, and there's interesting evidence that fake news travels faster, for example, than real news, which I find fascinating. If that's the case, we need to use technology to solve some of those problems, to track fake news or flag it, to track people's data, to map where it's going and who's using it and who's monetizing it. That's not a trivial challenge, but what's going on in social media, of course, is very, very clever. There's some incredible innovation at the nexus of psychology and technology that's allowing people to guide your attention, to understand what you read and for how long and how you react to it, and then feed you additional content as a result. That whole area of how the individual interacts with social media and online services is very, very clever and carefully designed and evolving fast. Let's put the onus on companies to use the same innovation to protect their customers. That feels to me like a really important way forward. And obviously, it's helped by regulators focusing that attention, I think. I don't think that happens by itself, purely out of altruism. I think we need regulators directing boards in that direction so they can, see the benefit in building trust through innovation.
Yeah, I agree. I'm going to, Alex, if I may ask you to take necessarily your government hat off just for a moment and re-put on your investor and entrepreneurial hat. And talk about what should be considered when developing new products and services or investing in companies that are developing those, and what practical steps would you be encouraging your portfolio to take in order to make sure that they were good stewards of other people's data?
Well, we've talked a lot about how important it is to have a clear regulatory environment in which companies get guidance on the right way to behave. And, the fact is that we can't expect companies necessarily to have adequate ethics on their own, and that's the point of having regulation. But, if businesses are developing technologies that involve the processing of personal data, they obviously need to think about the relationship they have with their customers and the basis on which they're doing that. They also need to think about questions of identity. There's been a sort of long-standing substrate of the internet that anonymity is somehow a sort of inherent property or a given right for users of the internet, and yet it's actually anonymity which facilitates things like the propagation of fake news. It's anonymity that facilitates the consumption of child pornography. It's anonymity that facilitates organized crime, selling drugs and other undesirable items on the internet. And so I think the question of whether building new systems that offer everybody anonymity is something that needs to be looked at very carefully. And encryption, of course, preventing the reading of messages between users seems very attractive until you realize that the messages are being used to facilitate the exploitation of children, for example, which I think most people would probably feel isn't an acceptable application. And so the question therefore is how to ensure that when one builds a new product or service, one actually pays proper attention to the balance between the harms that can be caused to people and the benefits which they seek to get, and not to sort of bake in unnecessary functionality just because one assumes that it's necessary. And also to remember that actually in many countries laws provide for the government to actually be allowed to have access to this kind of information from time to time, where there is necessity and where it's proportional to do so. And I think it's really important for everybody to accept that actually there are situations where governments should be allowed to do that, because otherwise it's the Wild West and no one will enjoy it.
Yeah, absolutely. So just in the last couple of minutes, and the sort of final thoughts, I want to turn to two things. One is, and I'll start with you, Melanie, if I can. What do you think needs to happen to make the internet a safer place, and where should the conversation around trust and safety online be focusing now in the next 12 months?
Well, I mean, I would say this, wouldn't I? But I do think we need some form of regulation. I don't think these problems can be solved by individual companies working on their own. And I think in so many areas of regulation, in so many different sectors, good regulation takes a risk that a sector or an industry is facing and draws out what the common risks are and attempts to tackle them through common rules. And you see that on health and safety regulation. You see that on things like financial conduct regulation. And the same is true here. I think whether you're an investor, whether you're a parent, whether you're a user, whether you're a child, at the moment, you can see, barely a week goes by without some new announcements about measures that are being put in place by TikTok or Google or whoever that look great, but without some sense of consistency, common benchmarks, common standards, it's very hard to know what those measures are really achieving and to really know as the user whether you can trust those services. So I do think some form of regulation is necessary. I'm really glad that the UK is taking that forward. And in the coming year, there's going to be a big debate in our country about the nature of that in our parliament. But I should also add something I haven't mentioned before, that Ofcom is already regulating under a European directive some of the platforms. So we're cutting our teeth on issues like age verification and safety for minors in particular with some of the platforms already, and are finding, through a good collaborative dialogue, how we're going to be able to make sense of these really big problems in a way that actually, as I've said a number of times and really do strongly believe, we do not want to damage the innovation and growth in these sectors and these industries, but we do need to find a way of tackling the underlying safety issues which consumers rightly are increasingly concerned about.
Brilliant, thank you. Tim, and then Alex, I'll come to you last. What's going to make the internet a safer place, and where should we be focusing in the next 12 months? Because it's going to take obviously more than 12 months to fix this Wild West situation that we're in. But for the next 12 months, what should we be focusing on?
So two thoughts. And I suppose if I'm mainly working with private sector companies getting to grips with regulation, I should sort of in some ways be pushing in the other direction. But actually, I think the well-designed regulation where there's adequate consultation, actually, I think is the industry's friend. It creates a level playing field. It helps companies know where and how to invest and what they should be providing. If you ask companies to figure out how to build trust alone, individually, as Alex and Melanie have both been alluding to, you either get the Wild West or you get very difficult, incompatible solutions. I think as long as companies feel they've had a chance to be consulted and engage around what are some very complex technical matters around how data is used, to how their platforms operate, then I think it's helpful to have clear regulations like GDPR that people feel they can work within as a framework. If it's constantly changing, then obviously that creates uncertainty, and markets don't like uncertainty. Just one final thought then on your second question, which I think is worth just mentioning. To put a different hat on myself, I'm also chair of a charity called the Mayor's Fund for London, and our patron Sadiq Khan is speaking during London Tech Week. And one of the things we help disadvantaged kids in London, and one of the things we think a lot about is who is being excluded from the digital economy. What can the digital economy, providers in the digital economy, entrepreneurs in the digital economy do to create more inclusion, create more accessibility to people who would otherwise be excluded or disadvantaged? What we don't want is an online world, to sort of oversimplify it, an online world for the affluent and an offline world or a paucity of services or second-class services for those that are offline and excluded. Yeah. We've got to try and find a way of making the digital economy what it should be, which is available to everybody. Okay. A leveler.
Okay, and Alex, 1 minute, if that's all right. Making the internet a safer place, where should we be focusing in the next 12 months?
So we've talked about the importance of international harmonization on what are and are not acceptable behaviors on the internet, so internet norms. And I think it's really important to ensure that we keep pushing on getting nations to agree on this, because that way we can have services provided from other countries, we can access them anywhere, and that will enable us to actually enjoy sort of maximum benefit with minimum harm. The other point, which I think is really importantly alluded to by Tim, is about internet literacy. It's about ensuring it's not just about physical access, can you get broadband, can you afford the devices? Those are really important, but it's also about understanding the environment in which people operate, making sure that children are taught about the benefits and the risks of using internet technology, and that becomes part of standard education, right from the get-go, so that everyone is able to make informed decisions about how they behave online, and also to understand when they are at risk of being exploited in various ways as they operate online. So I think those are, the sort of key directions of travel that I would like to see further progress on, that I hope will enable everybody to feel like they can and should have trust in the internet and to enjoy the benefits of the internet, which obviously are very considerable.
Brilliant. Well, I think that's a fantastic summation. And Tim, Melanie, and Alex, thank you very much for the time and the expertise and for what you're doing every day to help make the internet safe for all of us. I think we've had a good conversation. Hopefully it will help the audience on the Global Leaders Innovation Summit to look to the government for leadership, and also for all of us to accept our responsibility and to look to collaborate with the government as we make our way through where we are, because the benefits, I think we all agree, far outweigh the risks, but there are some risks that need to be navigated. Thanks very much, everybody, and have a great London Tech Week.